that you can directly rely upon. So why is it that induced earthquakes are suddenly an issue? We've known about these for over 100 years. And what's really happened is this dramatic increase in seismicity that I showed you a little bit earlier in the talk, is that the earthquake rate has increased by more than a factor of 10. You look at this period from 1973 to 2008, and we had 852 earthquakes, about 24 or so earthquakes per year. And in the subsequent 9 years, we saw nearly 3 times as many earthquakes in this much shorter period of time. So there's a very dramatic change. And again, I'm looking at magnitude 3 and larger earthquakes. And the reason we're looking at 3 and larger earthquakes is that we're certain that we're seeing all of these earthquakes throughout this study period. While our recording capabilities and our earthquake detection capabilities have changed over time and in general gotten better, even back in 1973, we were able to see all of these magnitude 3 earthquakes. So the signal that we're seeing here is not a function of our capabilities, but is actually a real signal. So let's take a look at what the seismicity looks like. So now we're looking at the period of time when there really wasn't a lot of induced seismicity. And you can see that seismicity is sort of scattered around the central United States. You can see that there's this structure of seismicity right here. This is the New Madrid seismic zone. This is an area of known natural seismicity. And you also can see right here the eastern Tennessee shear zone. This, again, is natural seismicity. But in general, the seismicity is sort of scattered around everywhere. You see some small clusters, but in general, it's sort of spread around somewhat randomly. And the average rate of earthquakes was about 24 earthquakes per year. Again, magnitude 3 and larger. So then, if we look at 2009 through January of this year, we have 3,200 of these earthquakes. And if you go back and forth between these, I would guess that this figure has more earthquakes on it if I compare these. But actually, we just have so many earthquakes lying on top of each other here in Oklahoma, it actually just looks like there are less earthquakes. And so our earthquake rate over this span of 9 years is now 357 earthquakes. But if you recall, we had a year with over 1,000 earthquakes per year. So this is really actually lowered by some of the lower rate earthquake years. And so this earthquake rate increase is limited to just a few areas. So now if we look at what we're looking at here now is a cumulative count of earthquakes. And so if we expect that earthquakes are going to be happening on a random basis at more or less the same earthquake rate, we'd expect there to be a line. And that's what we see right here from 1995 to 2008. And things start turning upward because our earthquake rate is increasing. So what I want to do is really show you that the increase in the earthquake rate is just coming from a few places. Now, I've alluded to the fact that Oklahoma and southern Kansas is really the source of most of this earthquake rate increase. So let's just subtract out the earthquakes from Oklahoma and Kansas and see what happens. Well, we've almost flattened out this line completely by just subtracting out Oklahoma and Kansas. And we know these earthquakes are induced. But let's subtract out some other induced earthquakes. We can subtract out the Raton Basin here in southern Colorado, northern New Mexico. We can subtract out the Guy-Greenbrier sequence in central Arkansas. We're flattening out even further. And if we take out a few spots in Texas, we've now flattened out completely. So now we're looking at a linear accumulation of seismicity. So what we're seeing is that the natural seismicity rate really hasn't changed. We're just seeing a change in seismicity in a few areas, and these are all areas where we're seeing induced earthquakes. Now, the earthquake rate increase that we're seeing in Oklahoma is so dramatic. The earthquake rate in Oklahoma is now higher than it is here in California. And so what we're looking at here, again, is a count of magnitude 3 and larger earthquakes. Shown in blue is California. Shown in red is Oklahoma. California's earthquake rate is sort of rattling around somewhere between 3 and 500 magnitude 3s per year, with the exception of these 4 spikes. These 4 spikes correspond to the timing of large earthquakes in California. As you would expect with these large earthquakes, you're going to have aftershock sequences, so you're going to have a very high earthquake rate. But you can see it drops back down the year after all of these earthquakes. Oklahoma, on the other hand, is averaging about 1 or 2 earthquakes a year until 2008 when it starts creeping up. And then in 2014, it surpassed California. And for the last 4 years, it's been higher than the earthquake rate in California. Right now, the projection is for 2018, we expect the earthquake rate to be very similar in both California and Oklahoma. Now, I've been talking about magnitude 3s for a while now. It's not just magnitude 3s, and it's actually we're starting to see significant damaging earthquakes. And so these are two photos from earthquakes in 2011 that happened just a couple of months apart that really brought people's attention to this problem. These were the first really significant damaging earthquakes that we've seen in this surge of seismicity. The picture on the left is from an earthquake in Trinidad, Colorado. This is the Raton Basin, so southern Colorado. You can see that this is sort of an old storage facility with a brick facade, and it lost a lot of its facade. And here's a photo from the Prague, Oklahoma earthquake, and you can see again this is a home that lost its entire brick facade. So we're starting to see larger earthquakes. And even though the earthquake rate started to decline in 2016, we started to continue to see large earthquakes. And in fact, 3 of the 4 largest earthquakes to occur in Oklahoma happened in 2016. The first happened just a few weeks into 2016. We had the magnitude 5.1 Fairview earthquake. You can see some small amount of damage associated with that earthquake. Then the magnitude 5.8 Pawnee earthquake was and is the largest injection-induced earthquake that we've ever observed. And then a few months later, we observed the magnitude 5.0 Cushing earthquake. And this earthquake was actually the most damaging of all of the earthquakes that we've seen in Oklahoma, despite the fact it is much smaller than the Pawnee earthquake. And the reason is that this Cushing earthquake more or less occurred in town, where these other earthquakes were really occurring in very rural areas, so we weren't seeing a lot of damage. And so this is really something to sort of step back and think about, that we've been very fortunate that most of these earthquakes are occurring in rather rural places. And in fact, the city of Cushing is relatively small. It's somewhere around 3,000 or 5,000 people. We're not seeing earthquakes in Oklahoma City. We're not seeing earthquakes in Tulsa. Now, Cushing is also very important because it's a location of very critical infrastructure in the United States. Cushing calls itself the pipeline crossroads of the world. There are 9 major pipelines that cross through there, including, many of you probably know, the Keystone Pipeline and the hotly debated Keystone XL pipeline go through Cushing, Oklahoma. And because it's the pipeline crossroads of the world, there's a whole lot of oil and gas storage. Approximately 10% of the U.S. crude oil is stored in this one town. Now, these storage tanks I've been out to visit. They're about a football field across. They're gigantic. And if you take a look at this Google Earth image, you can see that there are a whole lot of these. They're really everywhere. And so in the city of Cushing, they can store about 60 million barrels of oil. For the beer drinkers in the room, that is 2 kegs of beer. If you're not a beer drinker, think 42 gallons. So your fridge is going to be awful full with the milk. So Cushing, as you can see, is a very important place, and it has experienced a lot of earthquakes. We were fortunate last year not to see any magnitude 4s in the area, but as I mentioned, there was a magnitude 5 in 2016 and a few magnitude 4s in 2014 and 2015 as well. So the next thing I want to show you is an animation of the seismicity in Oklahoma. I've shown you in a graph how these earthquakes have behaved, but I feel like this animation really shows it better. You'll see things popping up. Those are going to be earthquakes, but you'll also start hearing the earthquakes. So the seismicity is going to sort of start in this area in here. This is near Oklahoma City. We'll see the Prague earthquake happen here, and then we'll start to see seismicity move northward through the Hutton Formation and then Mississippi and into Kansas. So I'll just let you listen. I really can't put it any better than that. It's an incredible earthquake sequence that we're seeing there. It ends in 2016, so really sort of at the peak of the seismicity, so we don't actually hear the decline, but you can see what a dramatic change that we've seen there.